It ain't about positional value. It's about getting good football players, and the Falcons got two of them in Bijan Robinson and Matthew Bergeron. So says my guest, Trevor Sikkema, on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And shout out to everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, I will be joined later by JT Wistrcill of the Locked On Utes podcast to talk all about Clark Phillips and what he can do in an Atlanta Falcons uniform, talk about his career at Utah. But up first, guys, let's talk with Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus. You hear him on the NFL Stock Exchange podcast, and he's here with me to talk about this Falcons draft class, starting with the two good picks that they made in the first two rounds in Bijan Robinson and Matthew Bergeron. Let's start our conversation with Trevor Sikkema right now. All right, everyone, you are Locked On Falcons, and of course, we are back with another illustrious guest. He is none other than Trevor Sikkema, who covers the NFL and the draft for Pro Football Focus, and you can hear him constantly giving his incredible takes on the NFL Stock Exchange podcast on your preferred podcast platform. Trevor, my friend, welcome back to Locked On Falcons.
I appreciate you having me on, Aaron. I don't know about incredible takes, but takes, we give out the takes. Sometimes they're incredible, but, sometimes maybe they're not. But I appreciate you having me on as always, my friend.
We'll let the listeners judge after
There you go. Love it. I love it.
So let's talk about the Falcons draft. And, there's a couple of players that the Falcons were able to nab in this draft that I know you were pretty high on, probably a little bit higher on than the consensus. And, of course, that starts with Bijan Robinson, the Falcons' 8th overall selection. I recall you putting him number 2 on your top 150 draft board. So the Falcons were able to get the second best player in this draft class, at least according to you, at the 8th overall selection. So I'm assuming that's a good move for the Falcons. Is that correct?
plus value in my book. No, there's the debate of when you take running backs, how early do you take running backs? And I don't think it's a set answer every year for every team. Now, is running back a position that sometimes has a low return on investment when it comes to the top guys versus the replacement guys that you can get on rookie contracts? Yeah, I think that definitely goes into the conversation. But when you look at Bijan Robinson specifically in this draft class, we just look at it from that perspective. He was basically the only blue chip offensive prospect that there was in this draft. We heard for weeks leading up to the 2023 NFL draft that GMs were kind of saying, hey, it's kind of a down year. It's not like there's studs and stars everywhere to be found in this draft class. And Bijan was one of those guys that you turn on one game of Bijan Robinson and you just go, okay, yeah, that's an NFL player. That's a really damn good NFL player coming up whenever he does make the jump to the NFL. And so, with that in mind, they were looking for a great offensive piece. They made a lot of splashes on the defensive side of the ball through free agency and with the trade with Jeff Okudah. And so that's where they put a lot of their free agent money, and they wanted to give themselves flexibility to go make a big splash with an offensive player, I think, in the draft. And, Terry Fontenot, since he's been the general manager a couple of years ago, he's made it very clear, it's not that he doesn't care about positional value, but he has a long-term plan for this team, and he's just trying to get really damn good football players. Taking a tight end at 4 and Kyle Pitts, that's very untraditional or unorthodox when it comes to those positional value selections. Wide receiver in a stacked wide receiver draft last year in the top 10, also probably something that you could have said, all right, maybe you could have got value somewhere else. But these are players that they really like, that they just plain think are going to help their football team out. Bijan's the same way. I love Tyler Algier in last year's draft. I had him as RB3. So when he got his opportunity to really show what he was made of, it was no surprise to me that he was able to really take that and run with it, full pun intended. But look, Bijan's just a different kind of back. I mean, he's so elusive. The vision's fantastic. The hands and what he could do in the receiving game. They clearly see Bijan Robinson like a Christian McCaffrey type, somebody who can impact the game as a true offensive weapon, if you will, instead of just looking at him like a running back. And so, yeah, Bijan is somebody who was one of my favorite players in this class. I know he was just very easy to like for basically everybody who watched him and evaluated him.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about Tyler Algier, and you were very high on him. And I remember having you on the podcast last year. And I'll be honest with you, Trevor, when you were talking up Tyler Algier, I wasn't as high on Tyler Algier. And I was just like, well, everybody has a different opinion on that, but the fact that Tyler Algier was able to have that level of success, so now I'm paying a little bit more attention to where you're stacking players, just because you did get that one right. And so when I look at the Falcons' second round selection with Matthew Bergeron, you were one of the few people out here that had him in your top 32, in ranking him number 26. And that doesn't necessarily assume that all 32 players at the top of your board you grade as first round talents or anything like that, but it did seem like there was some late buzz that a player like Bergeron could sneak into the first round. There was some rumors that the Cowboys were ready to take him at the end of round one, and we're debating him and Mazi Smith. They ultimately went with Mazi Smith. But what was it about Matthew Bergeron that you really liked about his game?
I mean, he's just such a good football player. I mean, he's played both right side and left side of the offensive line while he was at Syracuse. Started out as a right tackle, moved over to left tackle. So he's got that versatility there. And for some offensive linemen, I think that when you switch sides of the center position, whether you're on the right side or the left side, being able to do that and being able to do that with a relative level of success, the way that Bergeron's been able to do, does definitely show me that you're just a natural along the offensive line, that you can be a true utility player. And not only do I think he's a left and right versatility utility player, I think that inside and out as well. I think he's probably better suited at guard at the NFL level, just because the measurables are a little shorter, the athleticism and the reach, the length, how much ground he can cover. It's not as much as it was for some of the top tackles in this class, but man, I love the footwork. I love the hand placement. I love his approach to hand fighting, how sometimes if the hands get broken, he reestablishes his position. I love the balance that he plays with. I love that the footwork continues to churn no matter what. You watch some guys going from college to the NFL, and you could tell they're big, burly guys. They got strong chest and backs and traps and arms, and they just try to move you with their upper body. They really forget that it starts from the feet up. And you can definitely see that with a lot of guys who are just really athletically gifted, these high-profile recruits. Bergeron's a little bit different. Bergeron's somebody who, when he fires off the line of scrimmage and he's run blocking, he gets his hands up and into you, and then those legs just start churning, and they never stop. And that is how he often makes up for maybe some lack of natural deficiency when it comes to athleticism, maybe some natural strength, and he just wins with technique in that regard. So I love this guy getting plugged into an Arthur Smith type of offensive line. I think he's going to develop that killer mentality, because some people thought that he didn't play with that mean streak as much as he needed to at Syracuse. And maybe I guess I could see a little bit of that. But when you got yourself and then you got Chris Lindstrom on the other side, you got to up your game a little bit, because Chris Lindstrom is one of the best finishers that we have in the game. So I think just by being along that same offensive line, he's going to up that intensity naturally. And with that being the case, and given the rest of his ability that I like so much, I think he's a future starter for them and a really damn good one at guard.
Yeah. So you spoke earlier about, Terry Fontenot, whether or not he values positional value like other people do. Falcons taking a running back and a guard with their first two picks certainly speaks to, maybe a little bit more of an unorthodox perspective. But obviously in rounds 3 and 4, the Falcons went to the quote unquote premium well with a pass rusher and a cornerback. And we'll pick your brain on those two players in Zach Harrison and Clark Phillips as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, of course, still more to come with Trevor Sikkema talking about the day 2 and day 3 selections for the Atlanta Falcons in their 2023 draft class. But before we get there, guys, I do want to tell you about the delicious snack that is good for you, because you won't have to deal with all the sugar and calories that you normally would have to deal with when you think of the word delicious and snack in the same sentence. And of course, I'm talking about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, because Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, but they're low in sugar, they're low in calories. But guess what, guys? They have a whopping 17 grams of protein, so they're healthy for you. You get high fiber as well. And they come in a variety of great flavors: churro puff, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, cookies and cream. And you can always go to built.com, check out their limited time flavors, and use the promo code LOCKEDON15, and you'll get 15% off your order at built.com. But now especially is a great time, because you can now find Built Bars at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. Guys, walk to the pharmacy section in Walmart, grab a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. And then if you're in Sam's, you can run and grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter puff or churro puff. Trust me, you will thank me later. So, guys, here with Trevor Sikkema of the NFL Stock Exchange podcast, which you guys can check out on your preferred podcast platforms. And, you know, you've talked highly about the Falcons' first 2 selections in Bijan Robinson and Matthew Bergeron, but I'm just curious, what did you think of their selecting Zach Harrison, the Ohio State defensive end, in round 3, and Clark Phillips, the Utah corner, in round 4?
I think they're good bets to make, right? I mean, when you're taking guys that late, it's hard to stack them up against, other starters, right? I talk to some fans and they're like, yeah, I mean, I like this guy, but I don't love him. And it's like, okay, well, we're talking about a 3rd or a 4th round pick here. This is a mid-round pick. That's exactly the way you're supposed to feel. So don't let that be a negative if there's some pros and cons of players that you're picking in the 3rd and 4th rounds. It's not to say that they weren't worthwhile or they're not going to pan out in some way, shape, or form. I like Harrison because he's a unique player, right? He's a really big-bodied dude, incredibly long wingspan. He's somebody who's got really nice movement skills for a guy of his size. Hasn't exactly put it all together yet when it comes to that pass rush profile, right? I think that that's still a work in progress for him. But again, 3rd round, they need good defensive linemen anyways. And Harrison, I think, gives you the ability to, you could play him as a 5 technique edge player in a 4-3. You could play him as a 4-eye guy at a defensive end spot if you're playing a 3-4, if you're in an odd front. So he has the body type to allow you to play in multiple fronts and get as creative as you want. And so that's what I like about Harrison and his fit with the team. And, when it comes to Clark Phillips, he's one of my favorite football players in this class, but it's hard to deny the limitations that he might have. It's not just that he's small in height. It's also that he's really small in arm length. And for a player who made a living and played his best ball as an outside corner, I don't know if you can play him as an outside corner at the next level. I feel like it's kind of like the Asante Samuel Jr. case when he was coming out a couple of years ago. And I liked Asante Samuel Jr.'s tape at outside corner enough to let him start out there. I would have done the same things that the Chargers are. Not say like, oh, this guy's got to be a nickel corner right away because of his size. But Samuel moved more explosively than Clark Phillips. And that's where I get a little bit worried, because even if you want to project him to an inside guy in the slot, I watched Clark Phillips. I think it was the UCLA game that they played him a lot in the slot as a nickel defender, and he just doesn't look comfortable. You could tell he's just not in his home position. He looks way more confident and comfortable when he's an outside corner. And so even the projection to say, oh, well, at the very worst, Phillips is going to be a fantastic nickel corner for us, I don't know if that's going to be the case. I'd love for it to be, because, again, this guy's got great ball skills and he's got great anticipation. He plays the game really in a way that you love to see, with fire and passion. He's got an attitude about him. I love that about my corners. But the height and the length deficiencies are going to show up if he's left on the outside. And I don't know if he has the fluidity and the short area explosiveness to be able to play nickel corner. So they're 2 football players that I do like, but I see the limitations in them that might hold them back from being this, really making this class like a home run class that they hit on these 2 guys.
Yeah, I can see that definitely. Any thoughts on the 2 7th-rounders and DeMarco Hellams and Javon Gwynn?
So I don't know Wynn nearly as well. I know he's just a big-bodied interior offensive line for South Carolina. Saw him a little bit when I was watching South Carolina's offensive line live, but didn't have a chance to really dig into his tape. Hellams, I do like the addition there, because in the 7th round, he's an experienced player for Alabama. Didn't get a ton of starting time, right? He's I believe a 5th-year safety for them. They've had other higher athlete safeties that they've played at the safety position before him, but this past year he really got a chance to show his stuff with a full season as a starter. And I just think he's limited athletically. There's a reason why guys have been elevated in the depth chart at Alabama ahead of him. So sometimes that shows up with tackling strength. Sometimes it shows up with pursuit angles when he's trying to go after a ball carrier. But he is pretty smart, and he is somebody whose motor is running hot at all times. And, when you talk about 5th, 6th, 7th picks, I think all fans want you to just take this giant swing at the bat and go for these like crazy athlete players who might work out. But those 5th, 6th, and 7th round pick guys have to build out the back end of your roster. They have to be your core special teamers. And safety is often a position that you have playing a multitude of special team spots. And that's what I feel like Helms can be. He's kind of that depth backup safety, but if he's making the game day roster, he's probably making a name for himself as a really good special teams player, maybe a gunner or something like that, how he's able to make his mark. And so that's kind of what I see from Helms. And again, a nice solid player to get that late in the draft who would contribute in that way.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. That feels like the great debate for those late round picks. Do you swing big for the, probably like the, FCS guy or whatever that, tested out of the gym, or do you just take the tried and true guy that was productive in the SEC or some of these other power conferences that may not necessarily have the high end athleticism that can contribute? And clearly the Falcons, with their last 2 drafts, going for 2 Georgia Bulldogs and Justin Schaefer and John Fitzpatrick last year, and then Javon Gwynn and DeMarco Helms, seem to be they're veering towards a certain type when it comes to some of those proven late round guys. But Trevor, before we duck out of here, I just want to pick your brain on the Falcons 2023 outlook overall. You talked a little bit about the defensive investments that they've already made this offseason, obviously getting some of the pieces on the offense at the top of the draft. Do you feel like this is a Falcon team that can, make a playoff push?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that they can make a run at the division, right? I don't think the NFC South is going to be sending, 2 teams to the playoffs. I don't really think that that's going to be the case, but the division title is wide open. I think that Atlanta's right there in the conversation. Of course, a lot of it hangs on Desmond Ritter's shoulders and how he plays, but you got to think that you got Bijan Robinson now. You got a great offensive line in front of him. Drake London, Kyle Pitts. It's more of that and even better in that offense. You got to think that that's going to put them in a position to succeed. It was tough going into the offseason looking at the Falcons' defensive needs and saying, okay, they need a lot of pass rush help and they need a lot of defensive back help. Normally, you can't hit both of those needs in the same offseason. So they really went after secondary. Love the Jesse Bates addition. Love the trade for Jeff Okudah. I mean, it was a low-risk trade for a guy who, could mean the world to them as a CB2 opposite AJ Terrell. And, depending on what happens with the rest of the roster, who fills in at nickel. Now it feels like they're decently deep in the secondary, where that was a major issue back in January when they were starting to turn the page into the 2023 offseason. So I thought they did a really nice job continuing to take steps forward to make the team better. I don't know if they're quite there yet as an established playoff team, but they're moving in the right direction. And over the next two or three seasons, I should say actually 1 to 2 seasons, again, more of the right moves. And this team is going to be right where it wants to be in their winning window to make some playoff pushes.
Okay. Well, you heard it there first, or probably not first, but you guys heard it from Trevor. And he's a Bucks guy. So if he says the Falcons are moving in the right direction, then it definitely is true. But Trevor, really appreciate you joining me to talk a little bit about the Falcons draft and offseason. Let the people know where they can find your stuff and what you guys got coming over the course of the summer in the lead up to the 2023 regular season.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the Bucks connection shows up in my Twitter handle. It is Temp Bay Trey, TRE at the end. And all the work that we're doing over at PFF.com, trying to predict what this season is going to be, analyze every team after the draft. And, even for everybody who's big time draft nicks, we're going to start diving into 2024 as well. So you guys can have an eye on who the players are that you need to know when the college football season kicks off too.
Absolutely. Yep. Always look forward to that pivot, that hard pivot to 24 that you're going to make? Just curious, at what point does your brain switch into 2024 draft mode?
I mean, it'll be, so we're in May right now. I'll say like end of May, early June, we're turning the page on the NFL Stock Exchange podcast. That's when we really start to get into summer scouting. We start to watch a lot of these guys, get very familiar with them. And at the end of the summer, we'll have a full, maybe top 50, top 75 of a miniature or way too early big board, I should say, for the guys that you want to keep an eye on for that 2024 draft.
Highly recommend it. And then, I didn't get a chance to watch you guys or check you guys out last summer for your summer scouting, but catching up with you guys when you were going through your positional breakdowns at the end of the season and hearing you guys refer to some of those opinions that you had going into the season during the summer. It's always interesting to see though, which players pop, which players don't live up. I think A.T. Perry was pretty high on either yours or Connor's.
He was my wide receiver 1 going into the season, and didn't end up wide receiver 1 when it was all said and done. But that's always so much fun when it comes to looking back and how guys panned out. You go back to the conversations that you had of, hey, this is what I'm hoping to see this year from this player, and like, did they achieve it? Did they not? Are they higher in the ranking? Are they lower in the ranking? So I love getting an early look at these guys before their final collegiate season, because it makes the process so much fun watching where they grew, where they didn't, and it helps kind of round out what the expectations are for them when they go to the NFL.
Absolutely. I think it's a great process to see who makes that jump, as you said, who doesn't, all that and more. But guys, check that out. And once again, Trevor, really appreciate you coming on and joining me here on today's Locked On Falcons.
Appreciate it, Aaron. Anytime.
All right, guys. So there's still more to come. Want to thank Trevor Sikkema, and we got more to come with JT Wistrcill of Locked On Utes discussing Clark Phillips to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But for everybody that is a everydayer here on Locked On Falcons and makes this podcast your first listen on your preferred podcast platform, want to give you a heads up on what tomorrow's show is. We will have Trevor's co-worker, Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus on, talking a little bit more about positional value, as well as some AJ Terrell extension talk. We'll pick Brad's thoughts on a number of topics on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All right, everyone. We are back with another illustrious guest. He is JT Wistrcill of the Locked On Utes podcast, and he is here with us today to talk about the latest Atlanta Falcon and the former Utah Ute in Clark Phillips, who the Falcons selected in the 4th round of the 2023 NFL Draft. JT, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
And let's start off with the beginning of Clark's career at Utah. I read that he was like their highest ranked recruit that they had, due to flipping from Ohio State to Utah, earned a starting spot as a true freshman, making impact right away during that COVID season. Just curious to pick your brain on sort of the journey that he underwent, over the last 3 years in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, he was a huge get from Ohio State, to your point. He was pretty much, he was locked in to go to Ohio State, but at the time, their defensive back coach had then decided to go to Boston College to become their head coach. So, so much of college recruiting now it's more so about the coaches rather than there's so much less of, oh, I grew up here, I'm dying to play for that school. It's so much more about the coaches now. So once that coaching connection was gone, the guy who recruited him, all of that, it was kind of like, well, I'm going to go somewhere else. And what did Utah offer Clark? A chance to play right away. Ohio State would have not given him that opportunity. So comes to Utah, as you mentioned, starts right away as a true freshman, the COVID-shortened season, has a strong year for the Utes, and it just got better from there. And, almost every mock exiting the 2022 college football season had him as a first-round pick. And then, the draft process and everything really caused him to fall. But I really think Falcons fans, not just when they first get their taste of this guy, but when he's really making plays on the field, they're going to quickly fall in love with him, just as the Utah fan base did.
Yeah, he's been a frequent pick for a lot of people's favorite player from this Falcons draft class, potentially a steal, as you mentioned, a player that was highly touted going into this past season, coming out of this past season, and due to that pre-draft process, maybe not having the height, weight, speed that I think a lot of people typically covet at that position, caused him to fall a lot further than I thought. Like, it didn't shock me that maybe he didn't go in the first round like some mocks were projecting him, but certainly thought he would be a 2nd round pick just because of the production that he had in college. But, speaking on that, other than just simply, the height, weight, speed stuff, do you think there are other factors that led to him falling on draft boards?
I will say there's some tackling concerns. I'll say some tackling concerns. Now I will say, granted, one of it was like you could see one of Anthony Richardson's really long runs against the Florida game, which I mean that one was literally Anthony Richardson's highlight reel to get drafted 4th overall, was just him shredding the Utah defense that first week. There are sometimes Clark, he just does look down and just he'll miss some tackles, and he's not the biggest and strongest guy in that regard. But I will say, I think at the NFL level, I just think as he continues to get stronger, I don't anticipate that being a huge issue. I think he's going to come in right away. I mean, we're talking about a guy who, like we said, I mean, this is a unanimous All-American. He had 6 interceptions last year. He had a 3 interception game against Oregon State. It's the most dominant game I've ever seen a corner play at the collegiate level for me personally. So I couldn't be higher on Clark. I think he's going to come in right away. I think he's in a great spot with the Falcons too. Just when you look at the other guys they got there now, and Jeff Okudah and AJ Terrell too, I think he could slide right into that nickel spot and I think do some really strong things. He is a great culture fit too. Having spoken to him personally multiple times, you were just like, this guy is a coach's dream. Like literally just everything a coach would want a guy to say is how he talks. He became a leader so quickly, even as just a true sophomore. And with only 5 games of experience under his belt, he already kind of galvanized and was one of the leaders of that Utah defense. And I just think he's the kind of guy, when you're trying to build and establish a culture, he's the kind of player and the piece you want on your team. And he had some big shoes to fill too, because after he had left the year before, Jalen Johnson, who's now a corner on the Bears, he was at Utah. So that was kind of the guy there. And he came in, look, you mentioned the high recruit. There was a lot of pressure on him to come in and perform right away, earns that starting job. And I mean, more than lived up to the hype, absolutely exceeded it. So I couldn't be more excited for Clark in this opportunity he gets. And once again, I mean, I just don't think he could have had a better previous season. That's where it's like, man, it's crazy to me he ended up falling, but so much of the draft season is height, speed, all these off the field things that don't particulate to just going back and watching the film and being like, whoa, look at this dude locking guys down who are a lot bigger than him too. So I do think if he needed to go against some of the bigger receivers, I don't think he would get destroyed on the outside every play. I think this is a guy who's going to be able to hold his own, and I'm really excited to see what he's going to do with Atlanta.
Yeah, he spent the majority of his snaps playing outside at Utah, but I did notice that he seemed to get more and more snaps in the slot as his career progressed. Was that just simply a matchup thing, or was there another reason behind them giving him a little bit more looks in the slot?
I think they felt much better about the guys they had on the outside too. Look, Clark was their best corner. We knew that he was the best player on this defense, but I think he is such a great weapon to use in the slot, and he can do some great things. I mean, watch him against Jordan Addison. Yes, Jordan Addison will beat him someplace, but there's a reason Jordan Addison's a first-round pick too, right? Like, we don't see any corner dominate his matchup against an elite NFL receiver. It feels like, yeah, you can shut him down a couple times, but they're still going to get there as a different various points. It's just the talent of the league. And obviously the league is so heavy offensively that it's just hard to hold these guys in check all game long. So when you're looking at Utah, they have 2 other in the 2021 season, really, their cornerback room was so ravaged. There was a thing that went viral about, look, in the Rose Bowl, Utah literally converted one of their running backs to go play corner, basically. Like, that's how bad the cornerback room was at different points. All the top corners had gotten hurt. So I think that forced Clark outside a little bit more. Versus this past year, you had a 4-year starter in JT Broughton and Zamiah Vaughn, who was another guy at Utah who I do think is going to have a chance to get drafted in this upcoming draft. I think you felt good about the guys on the outside. I really like this Utah secondary. They were one of the better defenses in the Pac-12. I think a lot of the reason you look and you see Caleb Williams shredded them is not just because, look, it's Caleb Williams. I mean, he's incredible, but the Utah defensive line and the pass rush was really subpar this season. So you had plays where those guys were trying to hold up on the back end for 5 seconds or even more. So you go back and look at the stats and you're like, oh, they weren't that good defensively. Look how many yards they gave up. But it's like, well, you need a pass rush. Like, you can't just cover all day long. It's not really feasible. So that's one thing where I think some of the numbers that, like, oh, you see Caleb Williams shred this defense, that's where it's a little deceptive to me of how the secondary was playing, because they really did hold up for the 3 to 5 seconds like they should. And then, oh my gosh, Caleb Williams hasn't been tackled, and we're over 6 seconds into a play and you're asking these guys to cover. Like, that's just, especially against the Jordan Addisons of the world, that's just not fair to me.
Yeah, that's the Caleb Williams special, where it's like you feel like you got him wrapped up, and then he breaks out of the pocket and flings a 40-yard bomb down the field, and you're just like, how do we stop that? But you talk a little bit about Jalen Johnson, and I'm looking down this list, and I'm like, yeah, man, Utah has been producing quality DBs throughout the Kyle Whittingham era, going back 15 plus years. You have like guys like Eric Weddle, Sean Smith, Bryce McCain, Eric Rowe, Marcus Williams, Marquise Blair, Jalen Johnson, Julian Blackman. I'm just curious, like when you rank Clark Phillips among those guys that went on to have success in the NFL, where does he sort of stack up among these sort of hashtag Utah legends in the secondary?
Man, I think, like I said, it's hard. Anytime you get Eric Weddle, right? I feel like Eric's got to go to the top.
Yeah.
Jalen did some special things for this Utah team too. I think Clark should be in the top 3 though. I mean, maybe that's recency bias, but man, and those are great players you just listed and rattled off. But I really think when you look at what Clark did too, and look, I mean, Utah's, once again, we talked about like they had a cornerback there, Jackson Smith and Jigba, historic number of yards. Go back and watch Clark in that Rose Bowl. He played well. Did he give up a ball or two? Sure. But he also had a nice interception on Stroud in the end zone. Like there was a lot of good from him just throughout his entire career. He helped this Utah team accomplish something that Jalen and those other guys hadn't, and that's becoming Pac-12 champs. And I do think he's a large part of the reason they were able to do that with his ability to win so many of those outside battles against a Jordan Addison. I look back last year against Oregon, that offense with Anthony Richardson leading the charge for the Ducks really did nothing against Utah. I think they only scored 9 points, actually, even looking back on it. Like, I really think Clark had an exceptional career. He was the guy who came in, and Sharif Shaw is the sensational defensive backs coach at Utah. Coach Shaw recruited him, and Clark said, look, and it's the same thing that Jalen Johnson said, actually, I'm going to be in school for 3 years. That is my plan, and then I'm going to the NFL. To be able to say that and then do it is exceptional. It speaks to the confidence Clark has, and he knew the work that was required to get there, and he just put that in and absolutely excelled. And there's one other thing I can tell you, Aaron. I've actually played basketball with Clark before. When I tell you this guy can leap out the gym, oh my gosh, that's why I think he will be able to play some snaps on the outside if he was need to, or if he gets matched up with the tight end on a play. I think he can go up top and be able to at least tip that ball away because he can absolutely leap. He is still a special athlete. I know the 40 wasn't what everyone wanted it to be, but his speed was never an issue on the field or on tape last year for Utah. So I really feel like he's going to be fine in the NFL coming up in his first year.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm really looking forward to the battles that he has this training camp with some of the other incumbent options that the Falcons have, particularly at that nickel cornerback spot where I agree with you. I think that's probably where he slots in initially, but I do think, and I haven't done a too deep a dive on his film. I did, during the season, watch him against Jordan Addison in that USC game. I'm a Pitt alum, so, I had to root for my guy, Jordan Addison, and it shamed me to see him just basically lock down Addison, especially in that second game in that Pac-12 championship, and it was just like, oh man, I have such a high opinion of Jordan Addison, so clearly I have to have a high opinion of Clark Phillips to basically lock him down as he did in that game. So I am definitely looking forward to going back and doing a deep dive on his film, but certainly a player that I think has the ability to play on the outside, and it'll be interesting to sort of see his development in Atlanta if we do get that inside-outside versatility like he showed at Utah. But JT, I really appreciate you joining me and sharing some of your insights. The basketball nugget is probably one I will borrow from you. And like, I've heard from sources that he's a really good basketball player as sort of an insight into that. So I really appreciate it. Let the people know what's going on for you at Locked On Utes all throughout the summer.
Yeah, on Locked On Utes, college football has become such a crazy world now with the media rights deal still up in the air. It's not even a sure thing that Utah will remain in the Pac-12. It feels like it's going to happen, but who knows? We'll be talking about that. There's so much recruiting news. The transfer portal has become crazy. There's a reason Jordan Addison is now on USC to the point, or was on USC to the point you were talking about, Aaron. So always fun stuff. And look, it should be another really fun season for this team. They have a chance to three-peat as Pac-12 champs, and it is going to be tough because we talked about Caleb Williams, but Michael Penix, Bo Nix, Cam Rising, Shedeur Sanders, the Pac-12 is loaded at the quarterback spot. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So make sure you guys head over to the college channels. So you can check out Locked On Utes, Locked On Pac-12, all the other great content we have if you're curious about the world of college football. And look, maybe even some of those guys who may be your future quarterback if it is a Caleb Williams of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Cam Rising was a guy that I saw a couple of games this season. And I'm like, okay, all right. I'm intrigued. So maybe we'll be having a future conversation about future Falcons later on next year this time, JT. So looking forward to whatever comes from that. But certainly really appreciate your insight on today's Locked On Falcons.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for us here. Just another reminder that tomorrow's episode is planned to be Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus talking about the Falcons draft, their offseason, positional value. Maybe they can go out there and get another cornerback, talking about extending AJ Terrell. So a lot of interesting topics on tomorrow's episode. So make sure you tune into that as your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, why not check out any of the other variety of shows on the Locked On NFL and Locked On Podcast Network, like Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting with the draft dudes. You want to talk I don't know, whatever, Locked On Ravens, Locked On Bagels, whatever, guys, make whatever you want your second listen, all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.